So you want to own a dry cleaning business, a counter, a rack of pressed shirts and suits, a steady stream of neighborhood regulars dropping off the same items every week. It's one of the most old-fashioned, dependable-looking small businesses left on Main Street. Here's the sentence that should stop you before you sign any purchase agreement. If you buy an existing dry cleaner, and it turns out the soil or groundwater underneath it was contaminated decades ago by a previous owner using equipment you never touched, you can be held legally liable for the cleanup anyway. Environmental remediation firms report that the average cost to clean up a site contaminated by the industry's traditional cleaning solvent runs between $1 million and $1.25 million. For a business that might sell for a few $100,000, that single number can exceed the entire value of what you thought you were buying. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually costs to open or buy a dry cleaner, why the margins are thinner than the steady foot traffic suggests, what's really sitting in the machine that's been running in the back room for 30 years, and why federal regulators just forced this entire industry into a decade-long mandatory transition. A dry cleaning business isn't one business, it's three, all sharing the same counter and the same rack of plastic-wrapped garments. Version 1, the drop store. A counter, garment racks, a point-of-sale system, and a relationship with a wholesale plant somewhere else that does the actual cleaning. No machines, no boiler, no chemical handling on site. This is the cheapest and simplest way into the industry, and the trade-off is margin. The wholesale plant takes its cut of every single order before the storefront owner sees anything. Version 2, the full-service single-location plant. The owner buys the cleaning equipment outright and does the work in-house, keeping the entire markup on every garment instead of splitting it with a wholesale partner. This version requires real capital and real regulatory compliance, but it's also the version with the most control over both quality and margin. Version 3, the multi-unit operator. A central plant doing the actual cleaning, supplying a network of smaller drop store satellites that never touch a chemical. This is how the most successful operators in the category actually scale, capturing the plant's full margin while spreading the fixed cost of equipment and compliance across many storefronts instead of just one. The range here is enormous, and it depends almost entirely on which version you're building. A drop store, since it needs no machine, no boiler, and no industrial build-out, typically opens for somewhere between $50,000 and $120,000. A full-service plant with its own equipment can run anywhere from $50,000 on the low end to $500,000 or more, with industrial dry cleaning machines alone running $15,000 to $75,000 each, depending on capacity and the technology involved. On top of equipment, plan for environmental permitting specific to whichever solvent you choose. An air quality permit for a traditional solvent-based operation can run $500 to $2,500 plus a possible hazardous waste generator permit of $200 to $800 on top of standard fire safety and wastewater discharge permits. Facilities using newer hydrocarbon or so-called green solvents generally face lower permitting costs, but still require documented handling and disposal procedures. None of this is optional, and none of it shows up in the sticker price of the equipment itself. Here's what a lot of first-time buyers don't fully appreciate. Traditional dry cleaners commonly run net margins of just 5 to 8%, with well-managed or eco-friendly operations sometimes reaching 10 to 20%. Labor typically eats 30 to 40% of revenue, rent and utilities another 20 to 30%, and supplies and chemicals 8 to 15% before anything is left over for the owner. For an established, well-located shop, owner earnings typically land somewhere between $75,000 and $300,000 a year. A shop generating around $200,000 in owner earnings might sell for $400,000 to $800,000, a reasonable multiple on paper. But that multiple compresses hard, down to as little as 1.5 to 2.5 times earnings, the moment a buyer discovers active, solvent-based equipment or any hint of environmental concern on the property. The healthiest-looking earnings number in the world doesn't protect you from what might be sitting in the ground underneath the building. Now for the part of this business that explains almost everything else in this video. For roughly 70 years, the dominant solvent used in dry cleaning was perchloroethylene, commonly called PERC, a chlorinated hydrocarbon that the Environmental Protection Agency classifies as a likely human carcinogen. PERC doesn't just clean clothes. Through routine machine drips, sewer discharges, and decades of handling practices that predate modern containment standards, it migrates into soil and groundwater, where it can persist for decades. It's the chemical behind thousands of contaminated dry cleaner sites across the country, many of them now Superfund or state-level cleanup cases. Here's the part that should genuinely alarm anyone considering buying an existing shop. Under environmental liability law, the current owner of a contaminated property can be held responsible for cleanup costs even if the contamination happened entirely under a previous owner's watch, using equipment that was retired and removed years before the current owner ever walked through the door. A buyer who skips a proper environmental assessment isn't just risking a bad investment. They're potentially inheriting a 7-figure liability attached to dirt they never contaminated. And in December 2024, the EPA finalized a nationwide 10-year phase-out of PERCs in dry cleaning. Any new machine purchased after the rule's effective window can no longer use it, and every existing PERC machine still in operation across the country must be retired within a decade. For an industry where a huge share of operating shops still run on this exact chemical, that's not a minor compliance update. It's a mandatory industry-wide capital replacement cycle with a hard deadline, whether an individual shop owner is financially ready for it or not. There's a second, quieter middleman built into the more common version of this business. Remember the drop store model, the cheapest and easiest way into the industry. That storefront owner doesn't do any actual cleaning. Every garment gets sent to a wholesale plant partner, and that plant takes its cut before the storefront owner ever collects a dollar. The storefront owner's entire margin is whatever's left after the plant's wholesale pricing, which means the plant, not the storefront, effectively sets the ceiling on how profitable that neighborhood counter can ever become. This is why so many successful operators in this category eventually try to become the plant themselves, either by building out their own equipment or by acquiring an existing plant and converting their drop store into one node of a larger self-supplied network. Staying a permanent drop store customer of somebody else's plant means staying indefinitely a price taker in your own business. Layer on top of all of this a genuinely difficult demand trend. The dry cleaning industry has been shrinking by roughly 2 to 3% a year for decades, driven largely by the rise of casual workplace dress codes, reducing how often people actually need a suit or a dress professionally cleaned. The category isn't disappearing. Wedding dresses, formal wear, and household textiles still need specialists. But it is consolidating with well-located, well-run shops capturing more of the shrinking pie as marginal operators close, retire, or simply can't absorb the coming PERC phase-out costs. Scenario 1. A buyer commissions a proper Phase 1 environmental assessment before purchasing an existing shop and specifically targets a location already running on hydrocarbon or wet cleaning technology instead of PERC, avoiding the legacy contamination risk almost entirely. The shop operates as a lean drop store initially, then reinvests early profits into its own clean solvent equipment within a few years, converting from price taker to full margin, plant operator. Without PERC liability hanging over the property, this business holds its full valuation multiple and generates a genuinely comfortable owner income on the industry's already thin but real margins. Scenario 2. A buyer purchases an established plant at an attractive price specifically because it still runs on older PERC equipment without commissioning a full environmental assessment first, reasoning that the shop has operated for decades without incident. Years into ownership, A routine soil test during an unrelated property transaction next door reveals groundwater contamination tracing back to the site, predating the current owner by over a decade. Under environmental liability law, the current owner is still on the hook. The resulting remediation cost, well into 7 figures, dwarfs both the original purchase price and every dollar of profit the shop had generated in the years since. The counter, the customers, and the daily business look identical to Scenario 1's. The difference was entirely underground and entirely avoidable with one environmental assessment before signing. So the next time someone describes owning a dry cleaner as one of the simplest, most old-fashioned small businesses left, the storefront part of that is true. But underneath the counter and the rack of pressed shirts sits a chemical history that can be worth more, in liability, than the entire business is worth in profit. A wholesale plant partner quietly capping how much a storefront owner can ever earn, and a federal deadline now forcing the whole industry to replace equipment it's relied on for 70 years. The clothes were never really the product. What's underneath the building and whether you checked before you bought it, that's the real business.